short-term courses for working professionals. Through the Ateneo Teacher Training Center and the Information and Communications Technology Center. The ICTC is a training center under the College of Computer Studies that offers highly relevant courses in this new normal, such as the Suite Productivity Module.
If you're a college graduate or professional looking to enhance your skills in information, communication, and technology-related courses, Ateneo ICTC offers short-term courses for professionals for continuing professional development.
Learn to utilize free G Suite apps for office productivity. Maximize the essential components of Gmail, Calendar, Google Docs, and other Google apps for online collaboration in your office or institution. Receive self-paced online learning program certificates and badges with Ateneo ICTC.
In 1989, the Ateneo Teacher Training Center was the pioneer to offer special learning program for the 18 units in teaching. Since then, the Ateneo Teacher Training Center has produced national placers in the licensure exam for teachers and hundreds of teachers both in the public and private schools. The Philippine Business for Education, or PhilEd, has partnered with Ateneo Teacher Training Center for their Scholarship for Teacher Education program to upgrade teacher education quality in the Philippines. Teachers of Ateneo de Manila, Xavier School, University of Santo Tomas España Manila, the Philippine Science High School, and teachers of other leading institutions have chosen Ateneo de Naga SLP for their teaching methods. Keep abreast with the modern teaching pedagogies PTTC offers: special learning program, executive class in early childhood education, executive class in special education, and executive class in physical education. Learn from top-notch teacher educators. Ateneo Teacher Training Center provides you access to success. Choose Ateneo de Naga University. Choose only the best.
Enrollment is ongoing for ATTC. Be an Atenean. Choose Ateneo de Naga University. The Ateneo de Naga University College of Education is one of the two centers of excellence in the Bicol region. Recognized as one of the top performing schools in the country, having consistently performed significantly and above the national passing rate in the licensure examination for teachers.
A true Atenean would always focus on building the competence at the same time, never disregarding the true character.
Ateneo education gave me opportunities to develop values in life that I hold now as a person.
It commits itself in forming teachers who are competent, Christ-centered, conscientious, compassionate, and committed to change, nurturing both children and adolescent learners in diverse settings.
Our graduates are employed anywhere in the world, as well as in our country, and occupying top positions.
I never also imagined that I would be a school head. I would really want to become a teacher. But because of Ateneo, it has pushed me to be better, if not best version of myself. And I've always accepted the challenge of being a school leader. Under the College of Education, we learn to love learning. And we always learn to unlearn, relearn these things so that we can always teach our students well.
Recently granted re-accreditation by PAASCO and participated in several C teacher or internship programs.
As what we always say, AGNU College of Education, one top choice. So be part of the college and be an Ateneo teacher.
Be an Atenean. Choose Ateneo de Naga University.
Nurturing Bicolano teachers for the Philippines and the world.
The College of Computer Studies aims to provide world-class and relevant computer education based on accepted international curricular standards.
Hi, my name is Ryan Ruby and I am a Bachelor of Science Digital Illustration and Animation graduate, batch 2007. Currently, I am a Senior Technical Director at Sony Pictures Imageworks, Vancouver, Canada. Ateneo Education has exceptionally prepared me for a smooth transition from school to work with its well-designed curriculum. Our laboratory was well equipped with the most up-to-date hardware and software. Also, the exposure was one of the key elements to my success. I remember one of the Ateneo school trips within Manila as a senior student made me realize where I want to be right after graduation.
I took computer science primarily because of my fascination of technology. Even the best programmer needs to learn how to interact with non-machines like colleagues, clients, everyone. And the human skills I learned not in the classroom but in the other activities that were made available to me by Ateneo. And those were some skills I learned outside of computers, which proved to be very useful in the real life. I've learned in the Ateneo, Ora Personalis. There's something so unique about it that it is always the foreground of building better relationships, troubleshooting conflicts, dealing with challenges in any form.
Be an Atenean programmer or animator, and let us guide you in enriching and expanding your knowledge and skills for the betterment of the life of the Bicolano and for the greater glory of God.
Be an Atenean. Choose Ateneo de Naga University.
Hi everyone, I am John and I will be your MC for this afternoon's event. To our guests, to our resource speaker, and to our dear participants, good afternoon to all of you. So this afternoon, we will be having this webinar on research-based education, a critical look into learner-teacher-centered pedagogies under the lens of critical and place-based education theories. This webinar has four major parts. Part 1 to 3 would be a series of lectures. These lectures would be presented to us, or should I say, discussed to us by a resource speaker. And the last part would be the open forum. In this part, questions will be randomly selected, and flash on the screen, and immediately our resource speaker will give an answer to the specific questions. So you might be thinking that it could be too long for you to be able to raise your questions. But to our dear participants, don't you worry, because in part 1 and part 2 of our webinar, there will be a 5-minute working break. And during that break, you can post your questions on our chat box, and our resource speaker will randomly select the questions. So let's take a look at the comment section for our viewers coming from different locations. So before we begin, please be guided by the following guidelines. First, kindly observe proper netiquette in this webinar session. And then we encourage everyone to participate in the comment section. And then relevant and essential questions will be selected only during question and answer portion due to the limited time. Other questions can be noted in the online evaluation form after the session. You will receive your e-certificate shortly after accomplishing the online evaluation form. I think our participants could be able to evaluate until midnight. So better be in touch. Okay. This webinar session by the Ateneo Teacher Training Center, College of Education, and the Information and Communication Technology Center, may we call on Dr. Bajola, Dr. Maria Luz Bajola, the Dean of College of Education.
The pandemic that we have right now is not responsible for the shift to online learning. It has only served to accelerate a shift already well underway, bringing a greater sense of urgency to institutions to demonstrate greater value. Online learning is not new, but organizing, attending, and accepting webinars as a substitute for traditional methods are new. Believing that learning and sharing of knowledge should continue amid the pandemic, and looking at webinar as a future educational tool, we welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on research-based education, a critical look into learner-centered and teacher-centered pedagogies under the lens of critical and place-based education theories. These 2-hour webinar, sponsored by the Ateneo Teacher Training Center, the Information Communication and Technology Center, and the College of Education, is timely, especially that as teachers, we are expected to provide an educational experience that is engaging, motivating, and effective, regardless of how it is delivered. The college is also proud to showcase one of its very own honed teacher in the person of Dr. Julie Del Valle-Lopez. Ladies and gentlemen, again, my warmest welcome and my gratitude for attending this event.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bajola. Before we begin, we ask the viewers to participate actively in the comment section during the talk. The speaker will be actively reading and answering your questions in the comment section. So let me share to you the screen to our another guest, Dr. Arnold Puriganit, the ATTC Director. He will be the one to introduce to us our resource speaker for this afternoon's webinar. So, Dr. Reganit.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Our resource speaker for this afternoon obtained her double degree, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in English from the Ateneo de Naga University, and graduated magna cum laude in 2003. In the same year, she was awarded by former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo as one of the 10 outstanding students of the Philippines in Malacanang. She holds a doctorate degree in comparative education, curriculum, and pedagogy from the University of Melbourne, Australia. She earned her master's degree in learning and teaching pedagogy and De La Salle University in Manila. As faculty of the College of Education and Graduate School of Ateneo de Naga University, she teaches professional education courses and courses on curriculum and instruction in the undergraduate and graduate programs, respectively. She also became the chairperson of the Secondary Education Department, College of Education, Ateneo de Naga University. She is a member of the University Research Council. She is a qualitative education researcher with research interest on ethnographic methods, learner-centered instruction, Ferreiran critical pedagogy, rural and urban education, pedagogical reform policies, culture-based pedagogy, and service learning. Friends in the academe, it is my distinct honor to introduce our very own Dr. Julie Lucille del Valle-Lopez.
Good day. First of all, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on research-based education. At the end of this lecture, we would be able to appreciate more fully the purpose of participant observation in understanding effective and good teaching within specific classroom context. But to achieve this, I would need to invite all of you first to take a critical look into learner-centered, teacher-centered pedagogy under the lens of critical pedagogy and place-based education theory. So in this webinar on research-based education, you are invited to take part in raising important questions such as why education research matters and why we need to use varied methods, including participant observation, particularly participant classroom observation in research endeavors surrounding effective and good teaching. These questions are particularly important in research-based education as we, teacher researchers, need to critically examine the gaps between the way we practice our teaching in the classroom vis-a-vis what is prescribed in education policies and what is not discussed in current education research. So these questions then invite us to ask further questions such as, what is our role or roles as teacher researchers? What one specific problem within our classroom that concerns our students, colleagues, or school, or the entire education system as a whole affect you personally as a classroom teacher? So in this webinar, therefore, we will be sharing our knowledge, experiences, and questions surrounding education and research, including our notions towards effective and good teaching. Particularly in the form of learner-centered education, or LCE, as this is placed in a binary position against teacher-centered instruction. So with this, my role in this webinar is not really an expert in education research, but more of a sharer of what I personally experienced in doing observation research to understand further what good teaching is in one specific cultural and geographical place in the Philippines. I will then walk each of you through my personal experience in research as I share with you some of the works I made with a focus on the current literature and pedagogical debates surrounding learner-centered education as a global education reform policy. So this webinar then invites you to look into the value of participant classroom observations in capturing a more holistic view of the very complex classroom cultures to understand more deeply what constitutes good and effective teaching within specific classroom contexts. So this presentation is organized into three main sections. The first section, the first part of this webinar, is a brief revisit of the original definition of learner-centered education as a framework for the educational reform policy in the United States in 1990s. This is followed by a brief discussion of learner-centered education as a global education reform policy. In this framing discussion, I present the issues raised by theorists of place-based education and how learner-centered education as a global reform policy could potentially dilute a country's sense of local identity as it seeks national reform in education. I chiefly use this discussion to highlight the global and local tensions surrounding learner-centered education as shall we say, a global traveling reform policy, particularly surrounding the question, at which level does true education reform happen? Most importantly, this section or this part of my webinar or lecture prepares the ground for a more critical review of the contextual issues that encumber the implementation of the global learner-centered education policy in local classroom context in developing countries. And the third and last part of this webinar discusses the contextual realities that impede the practical practice of learner-centered education in developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, of course, in the Philippines also. This section opens the debates surrounding learner-centered education as a teaching framework and teacher-centered education as a traditional practice. In this discussion, I present both economic and cultural issues raised within recent studies on learner-centered education. I shall walk you through in examining the issues raised in these studies and will try to argue that cultural rather than economic issues are perceived as the more concrete barrier to the implementation of learner-centered education in today's classrooms in Southeast Asia. While engaging with the problematic nature of the implementation of learner-centered education across cultural contexts, I foreshadow the need to revisit the definitions, particularly those that hold to a distinct binary between learner-centered and teacher-centered practices. So within this discussion in this webinar, I will invite you to examine the degree to which the original concept or definition of learner-centered, of what learner-centered is, retained as this instructional approach is appropriated or transplanted in various cultural contexts. So, sorry for the background noise. Overall, this presentation will be mainly about research-based education with a focus on two modes of pedagogies. First is the learner-centered pedagogy, and the second is direct, explicit instruction, which is labeled as teacher-centered instruction. These two pedagogies will be further examined using two theories. First, Joe Kincheloe's critical pedagogy, and second, David Grunewald's critical pedagogy of plays. So at the end of this lecture, this webinar, I plan to tie these pedagogies and education theory to trouble our conceptions of what good or effective teaching is, at least within the context of the Philippines, particularly in my hometown, in Naga City, in the province of Camarines Sur, in the Philippines. So, speaking of effective teaching, before we start with the actual lecture in this webinar, let us first have a very short and simple activity. So I will be presenting some 2 images per slide, and I would like you to choose one classroom image which you think is the more effective teaching at a first glance, so without much thought or analysis. So in the chat box below, kindly post a comment. In that post, choose your photo. So post a comment, the choice by typing in the letter or the number of the photo which you think portrays a more effective, if not more learner-centered classroom. Okay, so let us start. So again, I would like you to choose one classroom image which you think is the more effective teaching at a first glance. Which one from these 2 images is for you a reflection of an effective teaching? Is it A or B? So type in and post your letter of choice. Is it A or B? Okay, I'm looking through your answers. Is it A, the classroom where the students are seated in aligned, straight seating arrangement, or also in B, but shows students raising some, possibly a learning material or a project? Which is more of an effective teaching image for you? Next, which one is more effective? Which is a more effective classroom for you? Is it 1 or 2? Is it this first classroom, classroom 1, wherein a couple of students are trying to consult each other, learning together perhaps, or the second one wherein one student is working on her individual task alone, on her own? Post your letter of your choice. Okay, third. So is it picture Y or picture Z? Is it a picture of a class wherein a teacher allows students to work, in say in partners and having an activity showing it to the entire class? Or this classroom which shows a student raising his hand to recite or to give his answer to a teacher's question, and the rest of the class is possibly looking forward to his answer or for their teacher to call this particular student? I hope you have already posted your choice via the chat box. And then next is this photo. Is it 1A or 2B? Is it a picture of this teacher quietly monitoring students while working on a seat work? Maybe the teacher here is circulating the class to monitor and supervise the students' individual work. Or is it this teacher who is joining a group of her pupils and asking them how they are progressing in their work? And the work is probably done in cooperative learning groups. So choose between 1A or 2B and post your answers via the chat box below. So you have interesting answers for sure. Later on, I'm going to try to process all of your answers. So I'm still waiting for the others to post their answers. And then this one, I think this is the last photo. Is it B1 or B2? Is it a teacher doing a lecture demonstration of a particular learning material of a particular aligned to a particular topic, and the students are in a whole class discussion? Or is it B2 wherein a student learns to do something, maybe learning by experience? Is it B1 or B2? So post your answers via comment in the chat box below. All right, so I'm looking forward to your answers. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to process your answers later on. So before we continue with this lecture, it is important to ask the question, what is learner-centered education? So I would like to think that we have some notions about what learner-centered education is and how it looks like in the classroom, as suggested in our activity earlier. So revisiting how learner-centered education was first defined becomes absolutely necessary, not only because a plethora of terms such as student-centered, constructivist, child-centered, problem-based, and active learning, among others, especially in the Philippines, now that we have our K-12 curriculum, have been associated with it and used interchangeably with the phrase learner-centered. This therefore runs the risk of carrying presumptions and misinterpretations about what is meant by learner-centered education, especially that it has been contrasted with the principles and practices to which it is opposed. For example, teacher-centered instruction. With such wide and loose usage of the term learner-centered education, it would then be helpful to trace its roots to provide a more informed ground in examining both its research-based success as a global education policy and its reported failures as a teaching approach in developing countries. Revisiting definitions of learner-centered as a term, therefore, becomes necessary given that somewhere along the way, when learner-centered education as a traveling global policy was adopted, translated, or borrowed across cultural contexts, there might have been some loose understanding over how learner-centered has been defined. So the term learner-centered started as an education framework in the rise of the progressive education movement in the United States in the 1990s. This learner-centered framework was then used as a guide for the education reform in the United States in the late 1980s in response to the deteriorating teaching quality and declining academic achievement among American children. So the earliest documents on learner-centered education as an educational reform can be traced back to the works of Barbara McCombs. So in these published works, Barbara McCombs discussed how the late 1980s and the early 90s were a time when many political leaders were responding to what some educators had called a crisis in education. So with such crisis threatening America's national standing as compared with student achievement in other countries like Japan, particularly in the, I think many of you teachers here know the Trends International Mathematics Survey or studies, the National Governors Association was asked to meet with the presidential committees and formulate the national education goals back then. So later, this became the Goals 2000 to Educate America Act, and was then followed with discussions on the critical need for national and state assessments that could provide greater levels of accountability for student achievement of rigorous academic standards. So within these discussions in this act, way back in 1990s, in preparation for learner-centered education, it was decided that the educational situation in America in the 1990s calls for the formation of the American Psychological Associations, or APA's Presidential Task Force for Psychology in Education. So I'm still giving you a little bit of a backstory or the history as to why there was a proposal for learner-centered education. So the project generated a document called the Learner-Centered Psychological Principles, the Framework for School Reform and Redesign, and its revision. It specifies 14 fundamental principles about learners and learning, and this resulting in a document developed by the American Psychological Association on Psychology of Education, and it provided the needed framework for the education reform, given the crisis in the US in terms of education in the 90s, as I've mentioned earlier, and continues to be widely disseminated to education and many educationists and teachers and researchers across America and abroad. So current time, the 14 psychological principles under the learner-centered framework are categorized into 4 domains of learning. So namely metacognitive and cognitive, affective, motivational, developmental, and social and individual differences. So for us education majors, we are kind of very much familiar with this concept or this theory of learner-centered education. So within this psychological principles is a definition of learner-centered education as proposed by the main proponent of learner-centered education, Barbara McCombs. So it says she proposed that the definition of learner-centered is a perspective that couples a focus on individual learners, particularly their heredity, experiences, perspectives, backgrounds, talents, and other individual differences, with a focus on learning, or that which is best available in terms of available knowledge in terms of what learning is and how it occurs, about teaching practices also that are most effective in promoting the highest levels of motivation, learning, and achievement for all learners. So here comes now the 2010s and our current time. So over the years, an escalating number of studies committed to searching for the practices that are most effective in promoting the highest levels of motivation, learning, and achievement for all learners. So If you will note, the term all in McCombs's definition of learner-centered education has become a focus of pedagogical debate, which raised the questions, by all, are students in disadvantaged, far-flung areas in developing countries included? So this problematic inclusive issue within the definition or notions towards learner-centered education will be discussed further later on. So by the turn of the 2000s up to the 2010s, a sizable body of research on learner-centered education have been conducted outside the United States, reporting the effectiveness of learner-centered education in delivering its promise of student engagement and achievement. So since then, learner-centered education has become the global education policy that it is now. So with its global status, learner-centered education has reached the shores of developing countries, particularly recently in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines through education reforms. So this is why in 2013, the Philippines launched the K-12 program, overhauling its curriculum system by adding 2 years to its basic education and mandating a radical shift to learner-centered education in pursuant to Section 16 of Republic Act number 10533, otherwise known as the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. So if you will note here, Section 10.2 under Rule 2 curriculum in the mandate from the Department of Education, of course, from the Republic of the Philippines, it says that the curriculum shall be learner-centered, inclusive, and developmentally appropriate. So I'll give you a little bit more, a few seconds to examine this slide. So with a focus on the first bullet here, the curriculum shall be learner-centered. This entire mandate, however, could be read as placing learner-centered teaching against the traditional teacher-centered instruction and creating a simplistic dichotomy between good and bad teaching in the Philippines. So, however, the Philippines is not alone in its reform towards learner-centered education. It is but one of the many developing countries within the international education community where there is, as Anderson Levitt observes, a prevalence of reforms couched in the rhetoric of learner-centered pedagogy, student participation, or democracy in the classroom. So within the past 40 years, there has been a growing body of research on learner-centered education, which focuses on non-Western countries in the height of their education reforms. If you notice, way back in 2000s, it was mainly about studies on learner-centered education, focusing in classrooms within the US. But as years go by, we now notice that there is an escalating number of studies on learner-centered education, particularly in developing countries, non-Western developing countries. For instance, Schweisforth found a sizable body of research conducted from 1981 to the 2000s, which focused on learner-centered education in developing countries. 72 of these studies, majority on African countries, are published in the International Journal for Education. So similarly, Kennedy observes a pervasiveness of education reforms in the past 20 years towards a more democratic and learner-centered curriculum in Asia, particularly among Southeast Asian countries. With such prevalence of learner-centered reforms, especially in developing countries, learner-centered education becomes a global phenomenon enshrined in international agreement promoted by international agencies and powerful at supranational level. Educationists, therefore, are increasingly concerned with how ideas and policy move around the world in the context of globalization. So just a little sharing on this bit. When I presented this quote in one of my lectures in a master's program class of my colleague in the University of Melbourne, wherein a majority of these students are local Australians. One of the students in that class raised the question asking me, so why does it seem to have this strong external pressures from the so-called international agencies for countries, particularly the developing nations or the ASEAN region? So my answer to that question has been elaborate, but allow me to share this with you, particularly you who are based in the Philippines, as I would assume you are more familiar of the context behind this. I had a more straightforward response, and I said, I remember one of the many reasons why there appears a strong external pressure from international agencies for countries, particularly in developing nations or the ASEAN region like the Philippines, is first, let me first point this out by international agencies. Michelle Schweisberg is referring to aids such as the UNESCO and other Western aids, which we Filipinos are very familiar with, such as the USAID or AusAid. So having said this, as the Philippines, for instance, as the recipient of these aids, or could I say quote unquote loans, our country is then expected by these international aid grant agencies to participate in their agenda in promoting reforms towards democratic and participatory education in the form of implementing learner-centered pedagogies in our recently revised K-12 curriculum. So a similar movement of curricular and pedagogical reforms, as I mentioned earlier, are adopted by our ASEAN neighbors who are, just like us, the Philippines, are recipients of international aids. So to continue, as more and more countries adopt learner-centered education as part of their curriculum reform agenda, modern structures of schooling and even pedagogies are arguably become increasingly similar. So this similarity among pedagogies across different countries, or what education theorists are referring to, or world culture theorists would call as isomorphism, has various elements of education systems, particularly curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, teacher autonomy, suggest how all cultures are slowly converging towards a uniform global structure of schooling, similar to the Western concept of modern schooling. This diffusion of a homogeneous Western global model of education could imply that the flow of the best education practices moves from the West and to the East. So it is in this premise of world culture theory that raises questions of power and hegemony controversies, especially that behind this isomorphism is a mechanism of change fueled by imitation, as countries gear towards a global Western model of education. Learner-centered education as a global education policy is riddled with similar issues of power, given its prescriptions for a paradigm shift, alongside a proposed model of teaching for countries to benchmark against their education reforms. Particularly in the Philippines, we're very much familiar of the phrase best teaching practices, or best or benchmarking of international teaching classroom practices. So Anderson Levitt argues that this form of mimicry could pose serious threats to a country's sense of identity as it seeks national reform in education. In her book, Local Meanings of Global Schooling, Anderson Levitt discusses the ways in which local meanings and values within a school system could get lost as a country mimics the global structures of schooling and patterns its pedagogical practices from prescribed international models as part of its education reform. Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed has long reminded educationists of the dangers of this mimicry of dominant Western models. Paulo Freire cautions about how Western models are perceived as superior to local structures of schooling. Such perception, as Freire emphasized, can become a threat to local ways of teaching and learning, where values held within are or could be possibly dismissed, if not ignored, until nations become alienated from the spirit of their own culture. Thus, as a country's structure of schooling and instructional framework becomes more global, it could run the risk of compromising its national ideals and local values. This is why Freire strongly argues against education reforms which are highly dependent on modern directions influenced by dominant external forces. He holds that for actual change or true reform to occur, the initiative to change must come from within the society or from within the country or the place itself. Because transformation for Freire requires nations to reflect on their own situationality and find themselves rooted in temporal spatial conditions which mark them and which they also mark. It is in this emphasis on the local as a prerequisite to true education reforms that Freire's situationality and place-based education theory meet. So sharing Freire's advocacy for true reform, place-based education promotes pedagogies that seek to reconnect students to the local or to their sense of place. So it is in this juncture that I am now introducing the theory of place-based education as part of our research-based education theme in this webinar. A change or a sense of place, however, is being challenged by current movement of external Western cultural ideas and the spread of a homogenized global system. So this is the notion held within Tim Creswell's theory of place, which claims that schooling structures and education processes must preserve those which define a nation's culture and identity. This should have been my slide earlier, but I'll allow you to look into this slide first before I proceed to the next. So Creswell argues against dominant cultural structures that dilute the authenticity of local values, as this could radically thin out the sense of locality and identity of a place and detach it from its long-held values and traditions. I'm trying to discuss this bit in this webinar because in the Philippines, you know that we are still we are still part of the big radical reform in the K-12 reform policy, which started in 2013. So thus, should a nation move towards a more globalized structure of schooling as part of its reform, it needs to critically reflect on how external dominant forces shape its local places and pedagogies. So to do this, it needs to ask two important questions. First, what needs to be transformed? And second, what needs to be conserved? These two questions represent the two essential concepts of David Grunewald's critical pedagogy of the place: decolonization and re-inhabitation. Decolonization suggests unlearning much of what dominant culture and schooling teaches, while re-inhabitation requires relearning and preserving those local cultural cultural patterns which teach us to live well in places but have been disrupted or dismissed in the age of colonization or globalization. What one chooses to unlearn or relearn, however, will depend largely on one's situationality or one's empathetic connection for a place. That intense connection to the familiar or to one's roots, or in Smith and Sobel's words, they call it love for the place. Because human beings protect and preserve what they love. If they don't know something, they don't attend to it. So they are talking about this in the context of education reform, true reform in education. David Grunewald and Sobel are suggesting that for pedagogies to reclaim the heart or to embrace this decolonization and reinhabitation, pedagogies must reclaim the heart. And how do we do this as teachers? Greenwald suggests that to reclaim the heart, schools should create experiences for our students to care for their places. In this way, the students as the youth and hope of the nation can identify what needs to be transformed and what needs to be conserved for their country. So it is in this framework of change that theorists of place-based education believe that true reform can be achieved. So I am trying to discuss this in this webinar because we are talking about change in education, and we are assuming or thinking, have these notions that reforms and change could only happen in a more general curriculum reform. But theorists of place suggest that actually true education reform can also be achieved within the grassroots level, within the classroom, especially when we allow our students to find connection to their place. By place, meaning their own communities. So there is a rural school within that rural community. And when we provide our students and our pupils opportunities to find that love and care or connection to their place, we as teachers are able to promote a different sense or a different notion of education reform. So before I continue with the next point in this discussion, allow me to insert a footnote here on what teacher-centered instruction is before I proceed to our next discussion. Because the discussion or the reintroduction of teacher-centered here is very important, because we had an earlier activity about the photos, which I ask you to examine and try to think which of those photos for you would show an effective classroom teaching. And sometimes we get to associate effective teaching with learner-centered, while the not so effective or the not so good type of teaching as teacher-centered. This is what I've mentioned earlier about the dichotomy between learner-centered and teacher-centered instruction, especially when there was a radical change in our curriculum, wherein its mandate required for a shift to learner-centered curriculum or learner-centered education, and to try to do away with teacher-centered instruction. There are policy papers, if I could just show you later, wherein the Philippines mandated mandated that teacher-centered pedagogies or classroom practices be implemented less, and teacher and learner-centered pedagogies to be practiced more in the classroom. So allow me then to insert here in this webinar a little bit of a discussion on what teacher-centered instruction is. So let me then give you a short history behind the phrase, or should I say the label, teacher-centered instruction. So the phrase came about in the rise of constructivist teaching in the 1990s and ushers in a new wave of teaching, often described as student-centered. So a sizable body of research on student-centered constructivist teaching conducted at that time provided prescriptions of what good teaching is and is not. For instance, in her critique of constructivist pedagogies and examination of the history of constructivist learning theory, Virginia Richardson observes that studies on constructivism at that time suggests that good teaching is constructivist teaching, and so therefore she said that constructivist teaching theory consisted of a foundation of constructivist learning theory and a set of prescriptions about what action should not be adopted from the transmission model. So these prescriptions were then used by education reformers to lobby the new alternative student-centered teaching to finally address the perennial problem of student underachievement in the US at that time. So this then placed student-centered forms of teaching, such as constructivist teaching, learner-centered instruction, learning-centered pedagogy, and active learning, among others, those other phrases which we associate with learner-centered education, against those modes of instruction which education reformers point to as the culprit of the intractable issues of student disengagement and underachievement. So direct instruction and explicit instruction then became labeled as quote unquote teacher-centered instruction. This is because the education reformers who sharply contrasted student-centered forms of teaching against these two long-standing modes of instruction created a presumed binary between good and bad teaching. Since then, the modes of instruction long established before the introduction of student-centered constructivist teaching have been positioned and categorized as traditional and teacher-centered. The now so-called traditional teacher-centered teaching carries with it some notions of bad teaching, given the negative associations assigned to it by those who advocate student forms of teaching. So before I continue, I am quite interested to know what is your idea or perception about teacher-centered. So in one word or two, what are those one or two words that you have in mind when you hear the word or the phrase teacher-centered? So kindly post your ideas on the chat box below, and then I will look into your answers later. So let us have a short 5-minute break, and I also have to charge my laptop. So I'll see you in a bit. I'm looking forward to reading your answers on what are your initial ideas when you hear the phrase teacher-centered? Does it have a positive or negative connotation? So I'll be seeing you after 5 minutes. I will be looking into your answers in the chat box below. I'll see you then.
Wait lang po. We are now in our 5-minute break. So as I noticed in our chat box, there are a lot of answers. So our participants are surely actively participating for this afternoon's webinar. So that is good. Now while we are on our break, you can post your comments or ideas in the comment section. So the speaker will answer some of your questions during the open forum. So kindly leave some comments or ideas to our dear participants. Thank you.
Welcome back to our webinar. By this time, you should have already posted your comment in the chat box about your initial thoughts about the phrase teacher-centered. So before we continue with the second half of this lecture, allow me to give you a recap of what we have covered so far in this webinar. First, I have reintroduced you to the definition of learner-centered education and the history behind its success as a framework of education reform in the United States in the 1990s, and then a global reform policy in the 2000s. Then I walked you through our discussion on education isomorphism, or what others call as pedagogical homogeneity. Simply put, this isomorphism or homogeneity suggests that almost all countries in the world follow a similar structure of schooling, be it in the curriculum or in pedagogy. For example, for you who are my Filipino colleagues, remember when our country was critiqued for being one of the last two countries for having only 10 years of basic education. And this criticism was used by the Congress to lobby the K-12 education reform policy in 2013. So in terms of pedagogical homogeneity, the Philippines and our ASEAN neighbors are now moving towards similar learner-centered teaching strategies as part of their or our education reform agenda. So in the way that these reforms prescribe the use of less lectures, so less lectures because these lectures are associated with traditional teacher-centered and therefore hold negative or bad notions of teaching. So these recent education reforms in ASEAN also prescribe the use of cooperative learning, which is linked to learner-centered teaching and therefore hold notions of good and effective teaching. Thus, the teaching styles in the Southeast Asian region becomes more and more Western as part of our national reforms in education, curriculum, and pedagogy, as our countries seek to increase student achievement. So this urgent and critical need to increase student achievement due to what is reported as crisis in education, such as student disengagement and underachievement, brought about arguably by the use of teacher-centered ways of teaching, becomes the argument used by various states to lobby and promote education reforms which advocate the practice of learner-centered strategies, because it is believed that by shifting to learner-centered education, again, a framework of teaching which originates from the West, it is only through this shifting to learner-centered education that true education reform will be achieved in the country, as argued by the many reformers who promote the use of learner-centered education. However, as I've mentioned earlier, the place-based education theorists thought otherwise. For the theorists of place, true reform can only be achieved or can also be achieved not in the form of grand curriculum reform, but through classroom pedagogies. Those classroom practices of teachers, whether these be traditional teaching practices or otherwise, which provide students the learning opportunities to reconnect with their cultural place, to care for their immediate communities. So these pedagogies, which teachers in the Philippines call as localization, particularly if you ask teachers in the public schools in the Philippines. So it is in this notion that theorists of place-based education suggest that true change in education could occur through classroom pedagogy, in the way the teachers teach within the classroom, and not really on extensive curriculum reform. So as the last point in the previous discussion before we had a break, this pedagogical homogeneity or mimicking international or globally prescribed teaching strategies, or what others call as international benchmarks of best teaching practices, which originate from the West, could pose threat in diluting the traditional and local ways of teaching. But let me emphasize this. Internationalization of education or benchmarking of best global teaching practices are not at all bad. In fact, this internationalization of education allows for opportunities for quality assurance of education standards among schools across different countries. But what I'm trying to say here is that while internationalization of pedagogies and schooling structures offers advantages in the education of many schools all over the world, it also has some dangers behind it, a risk which some may often ignore or dismiss. The risk here is captured in this one critical question, and that is, as we copy or mimic other countries' frameworks of teaching, in the way we follow their templates for curriculum and pedagogy, here is that important question. What skills and values are lost, say in the Philippines, when we put aside whole class lectures and replace these with, say, cooperative learning tasks for our Filipino students? What valued Filipino skills and attitudes which are developed and culturated, should we say, which are only developed or best developed and enculturated within our practice of traditional whole class lectures, are then lost when we shift to cooperative learning strategies in our classroom. So let me repeat that important epistemological question. What essential values or skills are lost in classrooms where traditional lectures and whole class instructions are less practiced? Traditional classrooms where the teachers are the content experts and classroom authorities. What essential values or skills are lost in classrooms where it is discouraged for teachers to practice traditional teacher-centered strategies, as outside observers often perceive these traditional ways of teaching bad or even harmful for our learners? Let us say this important, let us ask again this important question. Having said all that about traditional teacher-centered, traditional instruction, and traditional ways of teaching, another question that could be raised is, what do our Filipino, particularly Bicolano teachers, think about traditional teaching? How about our students? Do they also perceive whole class lectures of their teachers as something bad, harmful, or ineffective? So these are some important points to ponder, which are very interesting dimensions to look into for us who are interested in pedagogical research. So let me then continue with the second part of our webinar on research-based education. So at this point, the need to ask this question arises now after our activity before the break. What is teacher-centered instruction or traditional teaching in the first place anyways? So the label traditional in traditional teacher-centered instruction, however, is, as Rosenshine strongly contests, is politically and romantically incorrect, especially that behind teacher-centered teaching, which was called before the label teacher-centered instruction was given or associated with it, it was first referred to as direct instruction, is a long line of successful research in education in the 1970s and 1980s, which developed the phrase effective teaching. So my former students and who are now my colleagues in the teaching profession, this is the reason why we have EDUM 203, the principles and effective principles and methods of effective teaching. By effective teaching, it is actually a long line of scholarship, of educational research, which is based on looking into the effective practices and the effective results of what we call direct instruction towards student achievement and learning. So effective teaching, according to these studies, reported to favor research-based practices that produce stronger academic achievement when implemented properly in the classroom. A strong advocate of teacher-centered instruction, Professor Shug, in his critique of studies which favor student-centered approaches in teaching, asserts that teacher-centered instruction has again and again proven its value in studies that show it to be an especially effective instructional method. Yet, according to Professor Shug, when self-appointed education leaders and administrators meet to share best practices or write about effective teaching, teacher-centered instruction, as he said, gets no respect. So the caricatures of teacher-centered teaching under the labels which Professor Rosenshine and Shug regard as misleading and incorrect arises from various criticisms raised in recent studies that promote student-centered forms of teaching. So let me again tell you a little bit of a background story about teacher-centered instruction, or specifically direct instruction, gaining that negative label of teacher-centered instruction through time. So in his book with colleagues, Professor Tarver and Western, Direct Instruction and Teaching of Early Reading, and in his critical essay, Teacher-Centered Instruction, Professor Shug strongly refuted the claims that teacher-centered instruction leads to student underachievement. Shug argues that such claims are erroneous and misleading, given that there is no available strong evidence that directly links teacher-centered teaching to student engagement and underachievement. On the contrary, a long line of research has found these teaching approaches labeled as teacher-centered actually effective for particular learners and contexts. So here comes a little bit of provenance of teacher-centered instruction. So teacher-centered instruction originates from two distinct lines of scholarship in educational research and curriculum development. The first is an approach widely referred to as direct instruction, which is associated primarily with the works of Siegfried Engelmann and his colleagues, whose research focused predominantly on reading. The other line of scholarship is associated with the process outcome research of Barak Rosenshine and his colleagues, who developed a model called direct instruction, which identified instructional strategies from available research from the 1970s until early 1990s that, when practiced, this direct instruction result in higher student achievement and learning. So direct instruction, again, this is the way of teaching which was now labeled as teacher-centered. So before this negative labels, direct instruction is an instructional approach from the behaviorist learning tradition. The curriculum and practice of direct instruction are based on the operant conditioning theory, which states that to bring about a regular occurrence of behavior, it must be reinforced. So our experts in educational psychology are very, very much familiar with this one. And they said that direct instruction therefore requires a teacher to give verbal lecture and strategies involving clear explanations, questions, answers. They also provide reviews, drills, and practice and corrective feedback. Feedback, which is very important, immediate and quality feedback, which is very important in direct instruction. It was actually considered as one of the core practices of direct instruction. So these are all given in direct instruction to elicit the desired behavior among students, which is learning. So based on the research on effective teaching, also known as direct instruction, teachers who use direct instruction continue to practice its strategies beyond the point where students make less and less errors until overlearning has occurred. It is important to note here that Engelmann's direct instruction is developed from research which closely analyzed the comprehension and reasoning skills needed for successful performance of a student in reading. So this direct instruction was found very effective within the practice of teaching reading. This is a major reason why direct instruction is largely practiced in the 1980s to teach reading and phonemic awareness, particularly in English. Our reading experts here are also, I think, very familiar with direct instruction, because perhaps the most well-known direct instruction lesson format is the DISTAR reading mastery. There is a particular book by Goki, Framework for Meaningful Direct Teaching. It discusses how Engelman and colleagues' direct instruction lesson format called for the use of highly ritualized, scripted, and phonics-based system of reading instruction. For successful learning to occur under direct instruction, a complete mastery of each reading skill must be achieved by each student before proceeding to a new skill. It is from this lesson format of DISTAR reading mastery that direct instruction became known as an effective way of teaching. So the practice of direct instruction requires two critical elements for it to be effective. First, an effective use of time and active student practice of content. And to be efficient in time would then require a high level of teacher control or management to achieve the learning goal, because under direct instruction, the degree of learning that occurs is directly related to the time a student is actively engaged in learning a particular content. So now we see that while it has been criticized for being overly rigid and routinized, given the high level of teacher management or teacher control, this is why it was associated with teacher-centered, because of the management or the control the teacher has over the academic content and the learning process. Direct instruction has established itself actually as a research-supported instructional model effective for particular learners and context, including those with mild to moderate learning disabilities. So in their book, from the works of Engelman and Schulg and Tarver and Western and Goki, research on direct instruction, their book titled Direct Instruction 20 Years Beyond DISTAR. It reported the results of their meta-analysis of research spanning over 25 years. These researchers, particularly Adams and Engelman, found that a large body of research attests to the effectiveness of direct instruction as an instructional model. In their comprehensive review of the available research from 1972 to 1996, Adams and Engelman identified 34 studies in which direct instruction strategies were compared to other teaching strategies. They found in their meta-analysis of the data from these 34 studies show that large positive gains from direct instruction, which is now called teacher-centered or traditional teaching methods, of student achievement in a variety of subjects, including subjects like reading, spelling, mathematics, and science. So Professors Adams and Engelman also found in the research that elementary and secondary students from both mainstream and special education were reported to achieve significantly when taught under direct instruction. So now we see the effectiveness of direct instruction extends far beyond the teaching of reading. By the mid-1980s, an increasing number of research were conducted to identify more specific practices and techniques under direct instruction that result in academic success among students. Now, a more recent book on titled Visible Learning, which synthesizes over 800 meta-analysis relating to student achievement. Professor John Hatie, an Australian academic, And he discussed how direct instruction has become a very successful approach in accelerating students' academic performance, as first outlined by Adams and Engelman in their studies in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So direct instruction, as Professor Haiti puts it, has a bad name for wrong reasons, especially when it is confused with didactic teaching, as the underlying principles of direct instruction place it among the most successful outcomes. In reviewing the available literature on direct instruction and other instructional approaches reported to have the highest effects on student learning, as well as observing best teachers in the United States, Haiti concludes that there appears no deep secret called teaching and learning. In classrooms under effective teachers who practice direct instruction methods, Professor Haiti notes that teaching is visible in the passion displayed by the teacher. So even these teachers or these classrooms may now be labeled as teacher-centered, but for researchers on direct instruction, particularly Professor Haiti, he would say that this control yes, the control the teacher would show or would have in teacher-centered classrooms, as outside observers might call it as control. What he described this is passion displayed by teachers. So it was very clear who was in control in those classrooms. The activity was visible in the air. So Professor Haiti was saying that learners learning under effective teachers is very visible too, as students experience a high level of success when they are actively engaged in activities provided to them by their teachers who are in control. For those classroom observers who are more of learner-centered advocates. So there could be no room for passive learning under these effective teachers who are teaching in what seems as teacher-centered classrooms, as Professor Haiti points out. He claims also that learning was not always loud and heated, but rarely silent and deadening. He was saying that although classrooms, which outside observers may refer to as teacher-centered, there are times when the students are silently working in their seats alone. It was not always loud and heated, but there is something going on there. There is still engagement. There is still active learning within the students. But some observers may ignore that or dismiss that or may not be aware of that. So effective teaching practices under direct instruction models therefore aim to develop visibly active learners instead of passive ones. So this argument now is trying to rebut the arguments raised by those who promote learner-centered instruction, saying that teacher-centered traditional methods of teaching, including direct instruction, produce passive learners. So just to give you a little bit of a summary of that earlier discussion. So the literature on learner-centered education, in the way that I tried to put it side by side, just juxtaposed it with teacher-centered instruction. So again, learner-centered education is a global phenomenon, which I discussed so far, foregrounds two major issues. So the first raises an important question on education reform. So the question now here is, Does true education reform happen at the level of global policies or from the grassroots levels of classrooms and schools? So I'm taking this shift. I'm just discussing earlier about teacher-centered, and now I'm trying to wrap it all up by summarizing what we have been discussing, because I'm going now to the next part of our webinar, a next topic. Perhaps Anderson Levitt has a better way of raising the question, which is, are education reformers better advised to lobby the global policies of international agencies or to work directly with teachers in a local school? Or in other words, can local educators hope to change local schools to suit local needs? Or are they bound by a global model that they may or may not see? So the second and more relevant issue within the context of this webinar so far, of our discussion so far, is the tension between the global and the local, suggesting that as a traveling global policy, learner-centered education appears to antagonize the local ways of understanding, teaching, and learning. By local ways, I'm referring to the traditional ways of understanding, teaching, and learning. This is why I added a footnote on what teacher-centered instruction is, by trying to trace back its history before it was associated with the label teacher-centered, and looking into the effectiveness of direct instruction as a pedagogy. So this global and local debate reveals critical issues of contextual realities as learner-centered education global policy is implemented from one country to another, coursing through as a national reform policy. So in the next part of our discussion in this webinar, these contextual realities that impede the implementation of learner-centered education will be discussed further, but in the context of developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asian region. I shall use this discussion to raise the possibility that issues of culture pose a subtle yet concrete barrier in the implementation of learner-centered education, particularly in Southeast Asian classrooms. So I think that's a lot of points to absorb and to think through. Even I have to kind of need a little bit more time to appreciate what I've just shared with you at this point. So let us have a short 5-minute working break. Let me ask you then about the question raised by Anderson and Levitt earlier, this one, which you can see on your screen. So may I, for us to, including me, for us to appreciate more fully the discussions that we had earlier, I want you to reflect on these two questions posed by Anderson Levitt. Where do you think real change in education could occur? Or to be more specific, I think the better question is, where should it start? Should it be from the grassroots up or vice versa? Should it start from the teachers themselves, pedagogy, classroom pedagogy, or from the ministries of education around the world through the policies they prescribe? Grand, extensive curriculum reform. Remember what we have discussed earlier. So yes, type in your answers through the chat box below, and I shall be reading your post, your answers as soon as you post them. But for the meantime, let us have our 5-minute break, and I will see you in a few minutes. I am looking into your answers. I'm sorry for the interruption. For those who have answered that maybe it's more of the curriculum reform, may I ask you this follow-up question? In what ways can classroom teachers like ourselves, how can we take part in this reform through curriculum development? In short, how do we teachers become more of an actor, more of an active participant in curriculum development? And for those who answer that it is more of in classroom pedagogies that we can truly achieve educational change, what do you think are these pedagogies? What specific pedagogies are this based on what we have discussed earlier? I'm very interested to read your answers here. Just to give you a little bit of a nudge there is a reason why I inserted a footnote on the historical evolution of the phrase teacher-centered from direct instruction. I'm kind of interested to know, for those who answer that it is in classroom pedagogies that we can achieve true reform, what pedagogies do you suggest or do you find effective as a classroom teacher, based also on the feedback of your students? Are these traditional? Are these what is labeled teacher-centered? Is it really all that bad? Or is it the more progressive learner-centered instruction? In what ways are these practices effective in engaging students? I will try to look into your answers, and then later I'm going to process it. You can post your answers anytime within this webinar. But allow me to proceed to our next part of this discussion. So, interesting answers you must have there in the chat box. So later I'm going to go back to them and try to tie them all together in this second part of this lecture. At this point, I shall now walk you through the purpose of participant observation in understanding good and effective teaching within specific classroom context. But I shall still be, of course, linking this next discussion to our previous discussion. So if you are ready, so there are still some others posting their answers, I believe. So earlier, we were talking about, I mentioned about specific classroom contexts wherein they were able to, teachers and researchers are trying to argue that in certain cultural and geographical contexts, there are some arguments raised that learner-centered instruction, same with teacher-centered instruction, may not work in particular learning context of varied cultures and geographic locations. So speaking of context, contextual issues encumber the adoption of learner-centered education as a framework of teaching in developing countries. There's this particular book written by Professor Michelle Schweisford. Was a very interesting book about learner-centered education and how these pedagogy appears to somehow appears challenging to be implemented in some cultural context. In her book, Michelle Schweisford, after examining 72 research studies that focus on learner-centered education in developing countries in the past 2 decades, reports a remarkable consistency across this range of research, which reports on the economic constraints these countries experience in implementing learner-centered education in their classrooms. Later, in her book titled Learner-Centered Education in International Perspective, Whose Pedagogy for Whose Development, Schweisford discussed more comprehensively how these economic factors became concrete barriers to learner-centered education in poorer developing countries. Economic impediments to learner-centered education are a critical issue for developing countries, considering that while it appears costless to implement, learner-centered education is, however, a richer world phenomenon. This is because learner-centered education requires activity-based strategies that demand the availability of varied teaching and learning resources and access to relevant equipment and facilities. These resources, however, are more likely available and accessible in developed countries, from where most learner-centered education prescriptions for schooling originate, as using the exact words of Professor Schweisford, which then places learner-centered education in its ivory tower as an education for the elite. The findings in a qualitative study of Yilmaz, this is a quite interesting study, can attest to this claim of Michelle Schweisford that learner-centered education is a richer world phenomenon. Allow me to tell you a little bit about this study of Yilmaz. In interviewing rural social studies teachers in a developing country, Yilmaz reports that the teachers who have positive attitudes towards learner-centered teaching are often discouraged from using learner-centered strategies. Why? Given the poor physical conditions in the classrooms, large class size, and lack of teaching materials and resources in their rural schools. Is this familiar? This report from Yilmaz. This classroom realities, as the teachers in Yilmaz's study report, make their practice of learner-centered strategies, which are group activities, learning by doing, self-directed learning. These teachers found these impractical and inconvenient, given that they are also required to teach a specified amount of curricular content within a limited academic time. I think our my Filipino colleagues and teachers here, as I remember, when I did my PhD and I interviewed and observed classes from teachers in rural schools in Camarines Sur and also in city schools in Naga City. These words reported by the teachers in the Yilmaz study are ringing a bell. They're quite familiar too. And as I also found these in the transcripts of the Bicolani teachers in my study. So economic constraints are, as Yilmaz concludes, a significant constraint in implementing learner-centered teaching, learner-centered instruction in specific context. So apart from economic factors, the rural teachers in Yilmaz's study also reported another factor that hinders them from practicing learner-centered teaching, and that is the culture of school the teachers are expected to abide by and the traditions embedded in the school. This is a very interesting dimension in this study of Yilmaz. For instance, one teacher in Yilmaz's study disclosed that in his school, so this is the teacher participant in the study of Yilmaz, the teacher reported, when a class is orderly and quiet, we're now looking into the cultural barriers of learner-centered instruction as reported in the Yilmaz study. When a class is orderly and quiet, says this teacher, it gives the impression that a teacher is still teaching and not absent from his class. So I wonder if this is also familiar within the context of our classrooms in the Philippines. So when this teacher uses learner-centered strategies such as group activities, for instance, which usually generates noise from the students, the principal of this teacher who randomly observes classes might perceive this teacher as an effective ineffective classroom manager and teacher, or assume that this teacher is absent from the class because the students are noisy. Well, in fact, the students are actually busily working in group learning arrangements. So in this case, the teacher in the study of Yilmaz expressed his dilemma between using teacher-centered instruction that maintains silence and order in class and learner-centered strategies that produce noise in the classroom. So there is another teacher in this study of Yilmaz who raised that the conservative rural community of her school has a significant impact on her students' mentality and worldview. This is again in line with the cultural barrier in implementing learner-centered instruction. Thus, this teacher finds it very difficult to use learner-centered strategies, such as group discussions, because her students who do not see multiple perspectives end up having disagreements and fights, thereby making the class difficult to manage. So as we can see so far from the two teachers in the study of Yilmaz, there is somehow a dimension of classroom management which could pose a barrier in the implementation of learner-centered strategies. So now a third teacher in the Yilmaz study raised another issue in practicing learner-centered teaching. This issue arises from her students being rural youth, wanting her, the teacher, to give them more opportunities for experiential learning activities related to rural life. While this teacher understands the request of her students, she expressed that she is limited to using more teacher-centered methods given the expectations from the rural village or the community that she, as a teacher, has to use the school time in preparing her students for the state tests, or for in the Philippines, it is this is equivalent to our national achievement tests, instead of using it in other activities. So this third teacher in the Yilmaz study is limited in using teacher-centered instruction because of the national state tests given to students. So the findings in the study of Yilmaz align with Schweizer's notion. Despite having positive attitudes toward learner-centered teaching, teachers may have a tendency to retreat to traditional practices when confronted with classroom realities or unsupportive management or inspection. By inspection, Yilmaz is referring, Schweizer's is referring to classroom monitoring, classroom evaluation. So it is therefore difficult not to notice that in a number of studies on learner-centered education, there is a frequent mention of teacher-centered instruction, especially when there are specific perceived constraints in implementing learner-centered teaching. So a combination rather than a replacement of teacher-centered with learner-centered practices appears a common finding among recent studies in Southeast Asia. For instance, in a design-based research study of PAM among 100 students and 2 teachers in Vietnam, it was found that several cultural elements hindered a full implementation of learner-centered teaching in the country. Among these cultural elements, as outlined, are the Vietnamese parents' expectations towards their children performing well in tests, and the students' high regard to their teachers as authorities of knowledge. In this study of PAM, it was noted that the teachers and students in Vietnam are hesitant of teaching strategies that are not closely aligned with examinations. If you would notice, this is somehow reminiscent of the report of the third teacher in the study of Yilmaz, which is, I think, a study in 2008, if I remember it correctly. Yes, and I remember it was in Turkey, I think. So kind of look into that and notice how there are similarities among different cultures in terms of the challenges that learner-centered teaching would pose in certain contexts. So with this, Vietnamese teachers find it more effective to combine the learner-centered strategies and the lecture method that they have been practicing. So this hybrid teaching approach, as PAM concludes, helped the Vietnamese students enhance their complex knowledge without compromising their test outcomes. So it's been 45 minutes so far. What I want you to do is to mull over the reports of from the Yilmaz study and from the PALM study from Vietnam and from Turkey, and and I really want to read your sentiments about this. Can you relate? Can you identify to the sentiments of the teachers um, um, in the Yilmaz study and in the study of PALM in Vietnam? In what ways can you relate to the report of the teachers in the two previous studies? Do you also share the same sentiment in terms of implementing learner-centered strategies in your own classroom? I wonder what your insights here are. Could I invite you to please post your insight or a little bit of a sharing? In what ways can you identify with the teachers in the Yilmaz and the PALM study? Do you also find it challenging to implement learner-centered strategies to the point that you have to go back and retreat using Troy's term to go back to traditional teacher-centered methods? Why? I wonder why. So I am going to give you another five working break, and then I will look into your answers. I will see you in a bit. Welcome back to our webinar. So some of you might still be posting their answers in the chat box below. So to continue, earlier I have presented you a couple of studies. One from the study of Yilmaz, and the other one is the study of Pam, which both somehow presented and reported the challenges that teachers have in implementing learner-centered instruction, to the point that some of these teachers, as they reported, would retreat to the use of traditional teacher-centered methods because of certain cultural and economic issues or challenges that obstruct the use of learner-centered pedagogies in their own classrooms. So we are done with the Yilmaz study and then the study of Palm in Vietnam. Now let's proceed to an interesting study of Tyrus Vastis in Myanmar and Thailand. So a similar conclusion from similar with the study of Yilmaz and Palm. A similar report or conclusion is drawn from the qualitative data of Tyrus Vutis in his mixed method survey of 19 students from Myanmar who were studying education as a course at a university in Thailand. Using web-based survey questionnaires, this researcher examined the student perceptions of teacher practices they experienced when they were in high school in either the refugee camps located in Thai-Myanmar border or government and ethnic schools in Myanmar. The qualitative study or the qualitative data in the study of Tero Vustis suggests that the students perceive learning from both teacher-centered methods, such as whole class teaching, and learner-centered activities like group work, debates, and student presentations. However, the students in this study identified two major challenges. Let me then show you the slide on the study of Tyrus Vutis in Thailand and Myanmar. So, in this study, there were two major challenges identified in the teacher's use of learner-centered practices, apart from the low resources in the classroom. Okay, so the first challenge is the strong pressure to score high in rote memorization-based matriculation tests or university entrance examination, which then compels the teachers to use traditional direct instruction to assist student memorization. Should the students fail, the teacher is held accountable and would risk losing face in public. This loss of face presents the second challenge to learner-centered teaching, according to this study. The students reported that their teachers need to establish their infallible authority as content experts and maintain power distance from their students to meet the expectations in their community. So given the cultural dimensions of how teachers are perceived in schools in Thai-Myanmar border, it therefore becomes difficult, as Tyrus Vutis noted, to suggest that this historic tight control of teachers as authorities must be relinquished as schools transition to a learner-centered education as part of their reform agenda. Seeing both the value of learner-centered and teacher-centered practices in this cultural context, Tyrus Vutis recommends that education reform efforts must also strengthen the long-established whole class teaching methods, further strengthening while promoting learner-centered teaching. This way, as the researcher concludes, the reconciliation of traditional methods would allow for the benefits of learner-centered education be operationalized in practical ways using methods local teachers already practice. So a blend of teacher-centered and learner-centered practices, which I think some of you have posted as a comment below, that it would be great too, effective, if teachers could combine both. So a blend of teacher-centered and learner-centered practices is also reported as the preferred approach in teaching among Cambodian teachers in a mixed method study of Song in 2015. Drawing from this teacher data, Song concludes that teachers in Cambodia do not simply assimilate and respond to new forms of pedagogies that would require them to alter their conventional ways of teaching. In a critique on education policies in Cambodia, a different researcher, Charlene Tan, states that achieving reform will be extremely challenging for the country in Cambodia. This is because Cambodia, as Tan noted in her study in 2010, still struggles with the fundamental issues in education, such as equitable access, quality assurance, and capacity building for decentralization. Given the situation in Cambodia's current education system, Charlene Tan agrees with the suggestion raised in an earlier study of another different researcher, ARS, on Cambodian education, that states that the country needs to temper its expansion of a westernized education system and focus instead on addressing the needs of its rural schools. To achieve the reform, still, we're talking about reform, educational change or transformation, if you want to call it. To achieve that education reform that the country, Cambodia, seeks to attain, Charlene Tan further recommends for the term gelling, or which she describes as the combining of foreign and indigenous knowledge to create new ideas and practices in education that are appropriate to the specific needs of a particular country. So this gelling, which Tan suggests, has already taken effect in Singapore. Now we are in Singapore. If you would notice, this is because part of this lecture is our discussion on the issues of learner-centered instruction and teacher-centered instruction in developing countries, particularly in the ASEAN region, as I mentioned earlier, as in our outline for this webinar. This is because it is very much recent in the reforms in Southeast Asian countries that as part of the education reform agenda, learner-centered education is being promoted, just like us in the Philippines. So I think it was in 2010s for Thailand to also have that curriculum reform, just like in the Philippines. So it was like a wave, an Southeast Asian wave of learner-centered education. So in her separate commentary, Charlene Tan discussed the ways in which Asian countries, particularly of Confucian heritage like China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, particularly those with colonial histories, which include the Philippines, could benefit from this gelling of global and local sources of knowledge. In most of these cultures, the implementation of learner-centered education is a challenge, given a common perception that a learner-centered way of teaching dilutes academic rigor, which is valued in this cultural context. So do you also identify with this one? That learner-centered way of teaching may perhaps dilute the academic rigor, which is valued in some cultural contexts. Do you think the Philippines also share that the same value of academic rigor in our schools? It is also perceived in these countries that learner-centered education does not provide a strong foundational knowledge for students. With these cultural perceptions that pose challenges in implementing learner-centered education in this region, meaning ASEAN, Tan suggests that, in line with her recommendation for gelling, Asian philosophies like, say, Confucianism, be explored so as to identify their shared principles, for example, the shared principle of Confucianism with Western philosophies education, such as, say, Dewey. So what is the similarity between Confucianism and Dewey's democratic education framework, in which the framework of learner-centered education is grounded on? Remember, learner-centered education is also founded on the framework of constructivism, and also Dewey's framework of democratic and participatory education, if I remember it correctly. So a similar suggestion is given by Charlene Tan for Islamic schools in Asia, where the learner-centered strategies such as dialogue, disputation, and problem solving have long been advocated and practiced since medieval times as part of the Islamic tradition. In this gelling, in this case, the gelling, which Tan suggests, could facilitate the implementation of learner-centered strategies in Islamic schools, such as in the case of Indonesia, where there is an increasing number of madrasa and sekolah Islam, or Islamic schools, that have already incorporated learner-centered pedagogies. Gelling is slowly adopted through Indonesia's subscription to an educative tradition, where the country sees compatibility between the inculcation of Islamic values and acquisition of global knowledge. The implementation of learner-centered education in Indonesia, however, is not without challenges, especially that the Western underpinnings of learner-centered pedagogies might, as Charlene Tan raised, be perceived as un-Islamic, as these could radically thin out the religious and cultural heritage of the Ummah or Muslim community. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. A similar challenge is faced among Islamic schools in Malaysia, where, as the researcher Hashim in the study conducted in 2007 observes, its students, even in higher education, are compelled to memorize religious texts and are often not encouraged to question or challenge ideas, particularly those given by the teachers. However, over the past few years, the Islamic schools in Asia, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, have incorporated more learner-centered pedagogies into their more established traditional methods of teaching. This then becomes reflective not only of both states' educative tradition, but also of Tan's gelling, where a hybrid between learner-centered and teacher-centered pedagogies usher in a true reform in education. So what is this now? Hybrid pedagogies. So hybrid pedagogies, where teacher-centered and learner-centered practices are combined, are what another researcher, Barrett, sees as a response to the challenges that confront a full adoption of learner-centered education within a specific culture. This could be traced from, as Barrett explains in his study in 2013, this could be traced from concrete impediments that go beyond economic issues in low-income developing countries. The challenge in implementing learner-centered education in its pure form. There is a challenge in implementing learner-centered education in its pure form is not only expensive in terms of financial cost and teacher time, which cannot be afforded in developing countries. Hybrid pedagogies could arise from cultural differences when one culture is expected to adopt a newer pedagogy, that is learner-centered teaching, from a more dominant culture, given that learner-centered education is a Western concept of teaching. This is why I discussed with you that learner-centered teaching, LCE, originated from the earlier works of Barbara McCombs as part of the education reform to address the educational crisis in the United States in the late 1990s. So more importantly, hybrid pedagogies result in how a traditional way of life in a community come in conflict with the underpinning concepts of learner-centered education, whose roots are Western, liberal, and individualistic, as stated in the study of Virginia Richardson in 2003. Local ways of understanding and traditions, as a different researcher, Stelmach, in his study in 2011, observes, poses serious challenges to the implementation of learner-centered education, particularly in poorer rural communities in developing countries. In her critical review of international studies on the issues in rural education, Stelmach discussed the ways in which new pedagogies, like learner-centered pedagogies, are perceived in rural communities as drastic shifts from their time-honored assumptions and traditional practices. Making such a shift is particularly difficult in rural communities as they value cultural maintenance to preserve their traditions. So should schools in rural communities adopt newer pedagogies such as learner-centered education? Stelmach, in her study in 2011, deems that these communities would find ways to align these pedagogies to what is valued in their community, or select those which, from that new pedagogy, select those dimensions which confirm the values upheld in their local cultural places. It is in this Stelmach's view that meets Barrett's claim that there is a need for a greater appreciation of indigenous and localized versions of learner-centered pedagogies, especially in this time when there is an escalating pressure to implement, to say the least, learner-centered education in developing countries within the controversial discourse of whether learner-centered education as a traveling global policy should be transferred, adopted, or translated, or borrowed, whichever term you think is more appropriate given the foreign concept or foundations of learner-centered pedagogy. So Barrett further claims that the polarization of teacher-centered, or the binary between teacher-centered instruction and learner-centered teaching, is oversimplified and needs to be reconceptualized, particularly within what is culturally valued as good teaching. And the prevalence of studies which report cultural constraints behind the practice of learner-centered education in classrooms attest to this need of a critical consideration of the local places, its cultural values and priorities towards education in understanding teaching further. So clearly, as a different research-based study conducted by Kirkbeck, Du, and Johnson in 2013, teaching is influenced by both contextual and cultural factors, both inside and outside the classroom. They argue that culture shapes a teacher's way of teaching, including her pedagogical decisions, in a way that, allow me to cite this. If a culture, from the study of Kierkegaard, Du, and Johnson, if a culture is not fixed, but something created and negotiated between individuals and context, could I just insert cultures from a Western part of the world where they value democracy, egalitarianism, and participation? With this cultures, lecture-based approach to teaching culture yields very little meaning. On the other hand, if one believes it is possible to present learners with a precise description and clear-cut picture of their culture, Kierkegaard and colleagues are referring to the culture of China, because this is the context wherein their study is in. A learner-centered way of teaching may be considered a waste of time. So this is a very interesting study conducted on the cultural dimensions that could obstruct the implementation of learner-centered instruction, but generally the cultural dimension of implementing a particular pedagogy. So, quite interesting, this study. The findings and discussions in the earlier studies, particularly those in Southeast Asia, give context. So let us go back again to Michel Schweisforth's claim that the history of the implementation of learner-centered education in different contexts, cultural contexts in particular, is riddled with stories of failures, grand and small. So these stories of failures, as told in the studies I discussed so far, direct us choice for more important discussion of the challenges behind learner-centered education implementation. And that is culture, may I emphasize this, culture along with its local ways of understanding teaching, learning, and relationship. This is one very interesting quote from Schweisforth when she said that culture is a subtle yet very powerful element that must be considered in examining the challenges teachers face when implementing learner-centered education in their classrooms. For instance, how learner-centered education is implemented in some developing countries was found to be particularly demanding in general because of the profound shifts required in teacher-power relations, where teachers struggles to balance control and attain greater sense of democracy in the classroom. So what I'm trying to say here is culture and not mere economic poverty obstructs learner-centered education implementation in the classrooms of developing countries. Don't get me wrong by the term mere. By mere, however, I do not mean to belittle nor to downplay this very, very serious impact of poverty as a real obstacle in how learner-centered education is implemented in poor schools. Instead, I seek to direct one's attention to the equally serious yet often overlooked cultural elements that are at play beneath the problematic implementation of learner-centered education in developing countries. This lifts the discourse of pedagogy from the existing dichotomies between teacher-centered and learner-centered into a conceptual reframing of good teaching under a social-cultural perspective. After all, a study of pedagogy, such as what you may want to do in the future, will and must touch on culture, given that pedagogy is, as Robin Alexander maintains, a study of teaching, learning, most especially culture. So we are now in the last part of our webinar. With this, allow me then to process the first activity, which I ask you to select by taking a brief look into the photos, which seem to show a more learner-centered or effective classroom. So the activity pushed us all to make quick and somehow create an overgeneralized views towards what are assumed for learner-centered or teacher-centered classrooms should look like. These overgeneralizations about traditional and learner-centered teaching strategies are not uncommon, actually. For example, in the study of Variation and Walsh in 1997, they caution about constructivism that stem from overgeneralization of the theory. And where do these overgeneralizations come from? Perhaps these overgeneralizations are drawn because of a focus on surface pedagogical features. The overt or the externally observable instructional practices in a classroom, understanding of instruction or any practice of teaching may be based upon how instruction looks, like those photos I showed in the activity at the start of our webinar. When supervisors pass by classrooms to monitor, to evaluate who among his teachers is effectively teaching or not, remember what the teacher in the Yilmaz study reported about the teacher or the principal passing by his classroom. Instead of this, and understanding what makes an instruction effective or good required a more holistic view of the classroom as a culture. So the combination of research methods such as participant observation and triangulating the data from the classroom observation with student focus group interviews and in-depth teacher interviews enable teacher researchers like us to examine the cultural conditions of learning and the complexities of teaching within a classroom. These research methods could provide us with the opportunity to identify those pedagogies which were strongly valued by both teacher and students. This is very important. This is one important insight that I gained from my study, that it is not just the perspective or the lived experiences of the teacher, but the students also, and maybe include those other stakeholders within a curriculum, the community. So again, let me repeat that. These research methods, particularly participant observation, coupled with student focus groups and unstructured, in-depth teacher interviews, could provide us with the opportunity to identify which pedagogies, those pedagogies which were strongly valued by both teachers and students as most helpful in student learning. Most importantly, adopting qualitative, in-depth, and immersive research methods could also allow for a deeper understanding of how local values could either reinforce or limit the practice of certain pedagogies, and also shape the conceptions or understanding of good teaching within cultural and geographical places. This is why one should be cautious with the look of a classroom, in that it may not provide the entire picture. Why? Although we are stating here the value and the great importance of classroom observations, there is also a limit to that. Observations alone, just as student and teacher perceptions gathered via rating scale alone, or other instruments, will not capture the complexity. While observation checklists or Likert scales may prove very helpful in positivist research in the forms of quantitative and mixed method studies, these instruments, however, may be limited in immersive and in-depth studies such as qualitative research and gathering rich descriptions from the empirical data. A set of unstructured observation forms such as this may help a classroom observer or a qualitative researcher in gathering thick descriptions of the phenomenon being studied from a more holistic angle. Later we shall go back to the slide to focus on thinking of a possible problem we observe in our classroom, which can be your possible research problem. And from this, a question may arise, which is, why participant observation? Why participant observation? Why not just observation? Pop in and pop out observation in the context of in the Philippines. Why participant observation? Or in other words, why participate? I mean the observer, the one who's conducting classroom observation. Why actively participate in the classroom activities, and why not just sit at the back and simply passively observe the classroom dynamics? Why participate in the classroom activities and become more involved in the class dynamics? And why engage more actively with the students in the classroom? Why participant observation? As Becker and Gear have an would raise, they have an interesting answer to this. And they explain participant observation makes it possible to check descriptions against fact, and noting discrepancies, become more aware of the systematic distortions made by the person under study. In this case, the teacher and the students under the study who are being observed. Such distortions are less likely to be covered by interviewing alone. Unstructured observations could therefore, again, let me repeat that, as unstructured observation forms, and not just the scales, the rating scales, or the checklist, could therefore allow a researcher to see the complexities and the multiple realities within the classroom he or she is observing. This is because classrooms as learning environments are very complex systems. Characterizing them using a single source of data or forcing them into dichotomous categories may cause teachers, evaluators, and researchers to unknowingly misinterpret the variables studied by removing the characteristics that make classrooms what they are. Okay, for example, teacher-centered instruction may be assumed to look different from learner-centered instruction, as what our first activity at the start of this webinar suggests. Strategies such as direct teaching, drill, and practice, and collaborative work all bring to mind placement of the instruction on a unidimensional teacher-centered to teacher-centered scale. Casual observation of a class using lecture or direct instruction may prompt one to believe that classroom follows a teacher-centered pedagogy, while using collaborative group work may be construed as already using learner-centered instruction, right? The problem within these assumptions or generalizations, overgeneralizations, is that teachers may believe they are using learner-centered instructions just because they have students work in groups. But we know as practitioners, as classroom teachers, that this is not necessarily the case. So with the renewed emphasis on teacher and student standards and accountability, it seems increasingly important to attempt more thorough understandings of learning environment. So employing data triangulation should be considered a methodological imperative in every assessment and research study involving complex learning environments to better capture the interplay among instructional practices in different cultural international classroom contexts, including student and teacher participation, their views, their perceptions, and learning needs, and even outcomes. This is because, why do we have to note this as something very important? This is because within a classroom is a culture where its school community shapes the beliefs, practices, and behaviors of teachers and students. A different researcher, Martin, in his critical essay in 1987, further describes schools as communities within larger communities, and classrooms are subsets of schools. Within this culture, schools have their distinctive patterns of behavior, attitude towards teaching and learning, and beliefs about education and the roles of teachers and students. So why did I quote this from Martin? The combination of qualitative methods such as participant observation, student focus group interviews, and in-depth teacher interviews, therefore, could enable teachers
Hello? Hello? Um, there might have been some technical difficulties or some power interruption because I think there is a typhoon uh, right now in the Philippines. While waiting for the ICTC, since we're already at the last part, we have already ended our webinar. So if you have questions, I can see your questions posted via the YouTube site or channel. You can just post your questions there, and I can gladly answer your questions. So yes, can you hear me loud and clear? Yes, loud and clear. So if you have questions, I'm very much looking forward to respond to them. Hello, everyone. I can see your posts. So if you have questions, kindly just post your questions via the comment um, boxes below. I hope you found the lecture useful in any way. Yes. So while waiting for the questions to be posted, I would like to take this opportunity bago po mawalaan ng kuryente dyan sa Naga City. I would like to extend my deepest thanks and appreciation to the ICTC through the team po of Sir Francis and Sir John for organizing and assisting this webinar. And also, I would like to say thank you to my Dean, Dr. Bajola, and my ATTC director, Sir Popoy, for giving me the opportunity to share with you the work that I have been doing for the past 6 years while I was doing my PhD research. So this is the work that I've been doing. Nako, kay Sir Armin, unstable na po ang net namin. Grabe ang lakas na ng ulan at hangin. Stay safe po kayo dyan, wherever you are. Now, for those who are still thinking about their questions, if you are interested to learn more about what my research is, particularly on learner-centered education, about place-based education, you can just Google. If you Google, you go to Google, and then you just type in Julie Lucille Del Valle, PhD thesis. You can download my entire thesis there in PDF, the entire 200 pages. You can view it. You could read through it, and I hope it could answer your questions, whatever questions you have in mind right now. And it will also inspire you to conduct research. And I'll be looking forward to working with you, making publications with you. I have a question here. From Mom Becky, I think the important thing is to make the students think. So whether it is TCI or LCI, so long as the students are given the chance to reflect on the input in direct instruction or on activity students. Yes, I think this is very important, allowing our students and future teachers and also teachers current teachers to reflect more on this dichotomy between teacher-centered and learner-centered. So maybe I'll give you more time. I think that's also what Dr. Torres is suggesting. I'll give you more time to digest the lecture and try to rethink and examine the issues that I have presented within the webinar. So should there really be a dichotomy between teacher-centered and learner-centered? For those who suggested that there should be a merging, a combination, I think we teachers already know the secret because we are practitioners in our own classrooms. We kind of know already, right? That at some point there is really a crucial need to merge or combine teaching practices. But the question there is, as what I have mentioned in my lecture, we have already accepted that it is good to combine. But which part of our teaching practices, classroom practices, should be teacher-centered? Is it our classroom management? Is it through our art of questioning? Is it through student-teacher relationship? Which part of our teaching should be learner-centered? So I think that is the more important question there, because we already know that combining methods of teaching are helpful. But in what part of our teaching should we become more teacher-centered? Which part should we become learner-centered? Depending on our context or the cultural backgrounds of our students, the local needs of the community also. Oh, there. I think the question of Jam, Jermaine, is what are the factors that need to be considered when developing place-based learning experiences? I think what I've mentioned in the lecture so far and from the place-based theorists, what they have been emphasizing is look into the very local factors that shape or influence the way we perceive good and effective teaching. So in short, it's really more of the cultural factors, whatever that means to the researcher. So it is. So Jam, I think your question is a very promising question, which you can look into in your future research. And I'm looking forward to actually doing that research with you in the future. So that is a very interesting research problem that you can investigate in your future research. From Christian Albert Badian, at this time of the pandemic, given the blended learning modality that we are implementing, such as the modular approach, how can we easily implement learner-centered instruction? That is a question that I myself and I think many teachers are still contemplating on, particularly those in the DepEd, because there is a very strong mandate from the Department of Education and from our national government to implement learner-centered. But how do you do that? How do you become learner-centered in this time of the pandemic when our options and yes, when our options and resources are very, very limited? So I think that is, again, I hope I can answer your question straightforwardly and have an answer to that question. But that's what is beautiful about research-based education. It is not the answer to the question that is important. It is asking the right questions that will enable you to conduct research. And the question that Ma'am Becky and the rest of you are saying, Ma'am Julie, sa mga hindi po nagbibikol. O ikaw, Ma'am Julie, what do you think? Teacher-centered or learner-centered? I think actually that is the question that inspired me to start my PhD research. And I've been trying to discover the answer to that question for the past 6 years. So it's really a very important question that we all teachers have to investigate. So I think the answer to that question is, kung ako, teacher-centered, learner-centered, I think this is the last question. As I've emphasized in the webinar, we really have to look into the culture, the very local ways of teaching, learning, and the way we build, the very local ways of building relationships with teachers, the way we understand and conceptualize teachers within the Filipino Bicolano context. And that's very, very important. I would always say that look into the culture, because I want to think that there should really be no binary between teacher-centered and learner-centered. My argument in my thesis, in this research, is that instead of looking at it as a binary or opposing dichotomy, the teacher-centered, learner-centered, I would like to think of these approaches as a spectrum, like a pendulum, moving back and forth. And so we ask, how do we know where? So ito teacher-centered, this one is learner-centered. There's a whole spectrum, because good teaching is a whole spectrum of teacher-centered and learner-centered. So the question is, how do we know where do we go? If we go here, teacher-centered, we become more learner-centered, we become less learner-centered, more learner-centered, and teacher-centered. My argument in this research is look into the culture, look into the needs of the students, rural, particularly the rural needs, the needs of the rural community, maybe the school community. So I think that's it. I hope I answered your questions. And I do not want to take so much of the time of my ICTC boss, Sir Francis. I think they are still on campus, and I believe that the typhoon is getting stronger now, and I don't want to I want them to go home now. So I think if you have other questions, please feel free to email me. Just email me at this. I will just post my email address, J Del Valle. Please feel free to email me. And if you have other questions or interested in the research that I've been doing about learner-centered and teacher-centered, just go to Google and Google Julie Lucille Del Valle PhD thesis, and you can download my entire PhD thesis in PDF format. Thank you very much. And stay safe. I hope all will be okay. And yes, I'm still reading your comments. Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much to Sir Popoy, Dr. Bajola, Ma'am Lu. Thank you very much. Thank you to our ICTC Ateneo staff, Sir Francis, Sir John, and of course, my deepest thanks to all of you who are still with us right now, despite the weather. I hope that you will all be safe and healthy. From Melbourne, Australia, this has been Julie, and I hope everything will be okay. Maraming salamat po.
Good evening. Since there was an unexpected blackout, so there is no internet connection, just some problem occurred. So may we remind the participants to don't forget to accomplish the online evaluation form. It would be flashed online. Uh, Immediately after this webinar, it will be open. So, and it will end later at midnight. So don't forget about it so that your e-certificate will be awarded to you. So to all participants, thank you to Ma'am Julie and to Sir Popoy and Sir Francis and to Ma'am Lut Bajola. Thank you to all of you. So don't forget to access the online evaluation form.
Magka-close ka, sir?
Isking maan na?
Hi, Sir Popoy.
Hi, hello, Teacher Julie. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you po, finally. Naayos. Na,
Uh,
tapos na po kita. Ano, di
yes, I
naman.
will give the closing remarks.
Oo, okay. Sorry.
Okay, so it is my honor to officially close our webinar on research-based education. First, I would like to thank Teacher Julie for sharing her time and expertise on research-based education that is supported by researchers, despite of busyness of Teacher Julie. My thanks also go to Dr. Maria Luz Bachola, the Dean of the College of Education, to Mr. John Francis Buzar, the Director of ICT, to Mr. Junjun Ilikay, our MC, and to my staff for assuring the smooth running of this webinar. We are all extremely grateful to each one of you for your participation, your insightful ideas and comments to the discussions of our resource speaker, Teacher Julie. Indeed, the success of the webinar has clearly indicated that we are building reflected teaching learning practices that are research-based by examining the gaps between the way we practice our teaching in the classroom vis-a-vis what is prescribed in educational policies and what is not discussed in the recent researches. There is no doubt left that we will rise above from the dismal performance of the Filipino children in the large-scale assessments if we act swiftly and immediately in adopting either learner-centered, teacher-centered, or hybrid pedagogy, depending on place and context, through participant classroom observations. By doing so, we understand better what constitutes good and effective teaching within specific classroom contexts. I hope to see you in the future webinars the center will sponsor. Again, thank you so much and keep healthy and safe. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Sir Popoy, and the pleasure is all mine. I'm looking forward to working with all of you again.
Thank you, teacher. Bye.
Bye. Maraming
Bye.
salamat po. Thank you very much, everyone. Until next time, stay safe in the typhoon and in this pandemic. God bless you all.
God bless. Okay, bye-bye.